Hello everyone, this is Professor Reha, Chief Information Officer of Clan Indigo Oni, here with the Gaming News Report. Now the reason why I'm doing this is because I was informed that this might be something people could be interested in listening to, and or watching. So for that particular reason, I decided to give it a crack, and I wanted to first talk about Amnesia, since this is a rather significant and important question of, can Amnesia Rebirth prove that single-player horror games can have lasting potential still? Now, to explain this, I have to go back and talk about one of its two inspirations, Amnesia the Dark Descent, the original one, obviously. The first thing that really should be noted about Amnesia the Dark Descent is that it was really an explosion onto the Let's Play scene and established Let's Players as a legitimate way of acquiring and maintaining viewers on YouTube, whereas before it was just something people were doing for fun for the most part, or something that people were trying to make popular or profitable, but Amnesia proved that it could be. And there are a couple of reasons for this. First off, its main character Daniel had the happy problem, I use that term loosely here, of not really having a whole lot of personality. He was pretty much a blank slate, because in story, he had, of course, amnesia, thus the title. And the Daniel you frequently hear and have referenced throughout Amnesia is almost a different person because of the amnesia, and you don't really identify the Daniel you play as with the Daniel you know of from the backstory, so it really allowed people to become the main character in a way a lot of horror games don't. It wasn't Daniel's journey you were controlling, it was your journey. And in that way, the scares and the tension of Amnesia the Dark Descent became more personal and real to you than they would in another horror game. So for this reason, Amnesia the Dark Descent was extremely popular, especially since it allowed Let's Players to really showcase their personalities in ways maybe a lot of other games would not have at the time, since a lot of the games at that time really had pre-existing, preformed main characters with their own thoughts, personalities, and opinions, which, while the Let's Players could interact with, didn't really leave any room for necessarily the Let's Players to become, to really talk in depth about their own reactions or react in necessarily the way they would organically, because to some extent the character they played as was having some form of influence on their actions, because after all, you were playing as that character, you were not playing as yourself. So that's an important distinction that Amnesia the Dark Descent really allowed. The second point in favor of Amnesia the Dark Descent is that it had a level creation option that allowed people to create levels and potentially interact with the YouTubers beyond the YouTube comments by creating a level for their favorite YouTuber, putting the YouTuber's name in the title, and then hoping that they would notice it, record playing it, and then put it up on YouTube. It was very exciting for a lot of people to be able to do that. And Amnesia had a really long-running level creation community even after people stopped playing it on YouTube actively. Even today, there are a large number of YouTubers playing, well, I say large, but proportionally it's not, but there's still a surprising number of YouTubers playing Amnesia the Dark Descent in preparation and in anticipation of Amnesia Rebirth, which is coming out, by the way, on October 20th. So it still is a very active community in that regard. So it's got a lot of lasting power. It sticks with people in a way a lot of other pure horror games have not. The only other horror game that has a lot of pure lasting power is Soma, but that's not as a result of its level, of any level editor or of any particular randomness involved or what have you, but simply by merit of its storyline and the questions it asks, which focuses a lot about such subjects as death, life, humanity, and eternity. And even without monsters, since Frictional Games released a safe mode that you could play Soma on that removed all hostile aggression from the monsters, even without the monsters, the game scared a lot of people with the questions it asked. So the storyline and the questions asked were perfectly enough to still create a lasting impression that even if you read people's comments on Soma now, today, on various forums, Reddit, even in Steam reviews if you cared to check, people still remember Soma. 4 years later, after they've finished playing it. It's not even a game you necessarily can play again. There is no replay value to Soma. But its message and its story are so deeply horrifying that you think about it for a very long time afterwards. So Soma has a very unique kind of staying power beyond gameplay mechanics or even gameplay gimmicks such as level creation that Amnesia had. And I don't mean gimmicks in a bad way, by the way, that's not necessarily negative. But its lasting power was purely on the strength of its story and what it was saying to you, the player, or you, the viewer, if you chose to watch it. Very powerful game. I'm not going to say anything more so I don't spoil it for those of you who either want to watch it or play it yourselves, since it's definitely an experience worth having. So, that was in 2016 that Soma was released, and since then we haven't had any really lasting horror games. Every other horror game is indie and flash in the pan. AAA horror games are generally action horror because they don't want to take away the gameplay of being able to defend yourself in an attempt to ramp up the tension by having you be responsible for your own safety, which is, of course, its own completely separate conversation. But nevertheless, there's not a whole lot of horror games that really stick with you. Some people will remember Little Nightmares, and that's fine, but it still isn't necessarily hugely lasting. And Amnesia Rebirth is going to be a very important and significant question in, can horror games still maintain that level of lasting horror, either through level creation, replayability, or just asking or having a really horrific story or questions. It definitely becomes this interesting thought, because really horror games as a single-player experience have not been doing particularly well. Yes, there's some good indie games. PT comes to mind as an excellent pure horror experience that can stick with some people. Death Stranding could be defined as a horror title that does ask some fairly interesting questions and has gained a lot of relevance in recent times considering quarantine and the global crisis of viruses. Death Stranding does have that particular aspect, but whether or not you consider Death Stranding a horror game depends upon your viewpoint. So I kind of am not going to fully commit to calling it that specifically, but you could. And if you do define Death Stranding as a horror game, then you do have that, but beyond those couple of mentions, there aren't really a whole lot of horror games that stick. Some people may remember Alien Isolation, but that's partially going to be based on the movie property rather than necessarily any lasting message or particularly horrific story. That's not to say Alien Isolation was bad, quite the reverse. Alien Isolation was an excellent horror game, but it wasn't lasting. It didn't have the kind of lasting potential Amnesia or Soma did. You probably haven't thought of Alien Isolation very much before I just now mentioned it, and even then, after this video is over, you're probably not going to think much longer about it. It was just a good horror game, and that's about it. Soma had a message that you remember, and Amnesia had both a significance to people and a level creation mode that allowed people to really put themselves into it as human beings, rather than just as spectators or players. So, Amnesia Rebirth has more writing on it than I think a lot of people anticipate. The question of, can single-player horror games still create the kind of lasting impression that multiplayer horror games do? Why do multiplayer horror games stick with us so well? Well, there are a couple of reasons. First off, there is the potential dynamic for a good time with your friends. that's always going to be an appeal. And I'm actually going to take Phasmophobia as my main example here as a popular horror game that has lasting appeal. Phasmophobia has a lot of things going for it that is the perfect recipe for excellent, lasting horror experience. One is randomness. While the level designs don't change much in Phasmophobia, although that can also change, the actual contents of the levels, the ghost you're coming up against, and how the ghost behaves is fairly random. There are patterns to the ghost's behavior, yes, and a lot of these are fairly predictable, but what ghost type you're encountering, the name of the ghost, how particularly aggressive it's feeling at that time, are all completely random, and it's something that is always going to be in question every time you walk onto a new site, is, do I die this time? Since multiplayer horror games are encouraged, and in gameplay terms, looking to actually kill you in-game. See, single-player horror games, generally speaking, aren't looking to kill you. They're looking to give you an experience, and killing you can set that back, potentially. Especially if you die often enough, which was a problem with Soma on release, is that people were dying too often, and it was rather inhibiting their ability to progress through the game and really enjoy the game the way they were looking to enjoy it. Which is why safe mode was so popular. But you can't really necessarily be threatening the player all the time in a single-player horror title, because that can cause frustration, it can break the immersion, which pulls away more attention and scares, and it's overall not really something that you can get away with easily in a single-player horror experience. But a multiplayer horror experience is a completely different story, because your allies, your teammates, your team members are either the ones killing you, in which case that's the goal of the game, such as in Dead by Daylight, or they'll continue on the mission and finish it for you, as in the case of Phasmophobia. So, in that way, multiplayer horror games have more leeway in terms of threats, scares, and tension. The other thing that Phasmophobia has is the capacity for perfectly natural humor. I've heard some people call the ghosts some pretty hilarious things while playing Phasmophobia, and I'm sure you all have too, as well as the various random glitches that happen because the game isn't perfect, which works in its favor in this case, because some perfectly amusing, really random things can happen, and it's great for breaking the tension, giving a moment of relief, and then ramping up the tension again becomes even scarier because you were just having that safe, happy moment 2 seconds ago. The third thing in favor of Phasmophobia is, in all honesty, its real ability to immerse yourself into the game. The people you play as, the characters you play as, don't have voices, they don't have backgrounds, they don't have personalities. They are just an avatar for you. You pick the person you want to look like, and everything else is you. If you play in VR, even your emotions are yours. They're not the characters. So that allows for a level of immersion that is difficult to pull off in a lot of horror games because they want you to have this predefined character. Even though it's not pure horror, think Sebastian from Evil Within or any Resident Evil character. People with personalities, thoughts, opinions, their own feelings, differing from yours for the most part, with the occasional exception. You're not going to think exactly like they will, and you're not going to feel exactly the way they do. And that breaks the immersion slightly. You get pulled a little bit out of it. It's a different experience controlling someone as it is to being there yourself, which is what Phasmophobia really does, is it puts you there. And as the graphics improve, as the game improves, which I'm sure it will, then I think you will find that it will become even more immersive and it will become even darker and scarier. It's simply a matter of time. So, with that in mind, Phasmophobia could be considered an excellent, almost perfect horror game for that reason, especially since at almost any given point, depending on the difficulty, you can run away from where the ghost is and give yourself your own tension relief, whereas in a single-player game, you don't really get to choose when you get moments of relief, except by pausing the game. Which, again, breaks the immersion that you're kind of looking for in a good horror game. So Amnesia Rebirth has a lot riding on it. Now, I do have a couple of concerns with this particular aspect. First off, the way they've been promoting this game, the main character that you play as is fairly significant. Even in some of the trailers, she has more voice lines in-game than Daniel did, if you exclude Daniel's flashbacks. So for that particular reason, there's going to be less capability of just breaking right in there and being able to really put yourself in those shoes and become the main character, which is going to be a little bit damaging for those of us with the nostalgia, looking for that same kind of time, and to a lot of people who played the original game, either to an audience on YouTube or otherwise, who are really looking for that pure Amnesia experience. It's not going to be exactly the same, because you're not going to be able to immerse yourself as well, I don't think. Furthermore, the plot is promised to be deeper than Amnesia the Dark Descent to about Soma levels. That doesn't guarantee, though, that the questions they ask or that the story that they tell will be so deeply traumatizing and horrifying that you'll think about it for years to come. But if it can do that, that's really one of the things it does need to do. So Amnesia Rebirth either has to allow you to immerse yourself so completely with an excellent story that you think about it for a really long time, years down the line. B, have a level editor to allow people that good old engagement with the YouTubers that they used to have with Amnesia the Dark Descent, although with the advent of Twitch that's not quite as impactful anymore as it was back then. Or 3, it'll just become a flash in the pan. It'll be another excellent horror game that you play once, you never play again, and you don't really go back and think about, because you don't really need to, because it never asked you any hard-hitting questions, or had any kind of significant conversation with you in the first place. And that's really what we're looking at with Amnesia Rebirth, why it matters. Amnesia Rebirth is that question of, can single-player games still maintain that kind of long-lasting appeal to compete with multiplayer horror? Because I'm not against multiplayer horror, I want to make that clear. I love Dead by Daylight and I love Phasmophobia. They're both fantastic horror games that have a lot to offer, even if maybe necessarily balancing for some of these is not the best. They still are excellent experiences, generally speaking, with excellent tension, great ability to break the tension and get you in that kind of flow of high tension and low tension. And Amnesia needs to be able to do that more as a proof that it can be done in single player games still, that we haven't forgotten that art, and if anybody can do it, fictional games can. So whether you play the game or you view the game, this is what Amnesia Rebirth is really going to be about. This is the issue at heart here, and this is why Amnesia Rebirth matters. Otherwise, really what we're looking at is a future of fantastic, constantly replayable multiplayer horror games and flashes in the pan of simple single-player horror games. Now you may be thinking to yourself, let me cap this particular video off by countering the thought that most of you are having. Well, aren't most single-player games just a one-shot deal, flash in the pan, you never play them again kind of games? A lot of them are, yes. But I have a couple of examples, and this is actually one of the reasons why I chose Stellaris as the background. Stellaris has infinite replay value. You can set any number of stars you want. Well, not any number, but you can set a large number of stars. You can set 1,000 stars. And then the game randomly populates an entire galaxy. This map here, this galaxy you see here, it's one of millions that could possibly be generated by the game. I could play this game for 100 years and never see... I could play this game, start a new game, every day for 100 years, and I would not see every single variation of galaxy that can be created by this game's engine, because they constantly are updating the engine and they're constantly creating new variables that the game can put into the galaxy. It's I could never do it. No one can. Not any individual. Maybe if you got 100 people for 100 years every day, maybe then you could find some clones, some cloned maps, but even then, it would be a fairly interesting experiment, but it would be ultimately worthless since that doesn't matter. The point is that for any individual playing it in a realistic scenario, it's infinite. It has infinite replayability. Now, not all of you may be familiar with Stellaris, so let me give you an example that you probably are familiar with. Minecraft. Every time you create a new world in Minecraft, random seed, totally unique world, another game that gets updated pretty consistently and the same seed works differently across different updates, and if you're really into Minecraft seed forums or Minecraft modding, you'll know that that's true, that seeds operate differently in different patches, so to speak, different update levels. So, you'll never truly see any copied worlds in Minecraft. In the same way you'll never see any copied galaxies in Stellaris. Sure, eventually, with enough repetition, you'll find a copy. But no, in a practical usage, it's never going to happen. So Minecraft has infinite replayability. Does that mean we shouldn't ever have games that are one-shot deals, fantastic games that are one-shots? No. We absolutely should have them. In the same way that books are worth it. A book is a story that you read, and maybe you want to go back to it because you really loved the story. Or maybe it meant something to you personally. It said something to you personally that maybe no other book has, or a movie. We rewatch our favorite movies all the time for that reason. Well, it's the same way with great single-player games. I played The Evil Within and The Evil Within 2 once each. I enjoyed the games a lot. But I know that there are quite a number of people who every once in a while go back and play them because they really meant something, or they really said something to those people, or they just really enjoyed the experience, the story, the characters, the gameplay that much, where when they're down they go in and they play those games because it unfailingly cheers them up because it's just such a good time for them. That's not necessarily what I'm talking about with lasting power, that's more of an individual thing. For example, the books that I pick up and read every so often, such as, say, Ivanhoe, aren't necessarily ones that you would necessarily pick up and read again for whatever it means to you. Ivanhoe, as a story, is great, but its meaning to me personally is different enough where I will occasionally pick that up and read it again. Among other couple of books that I would do this with. You have your own books that you pick up and read again occasionally, when you're in the mood, when you want to relive that, or when you just really want to hear that message that it speaks to you again, if it did speak to you in some way. And single-player games do the same thing as movies and as books that we particularly enjoy and connect with. So there's always going to be a place for them. But in terms of lasting power, I'm talking about a broad audience. Some way, an audience that can go into a game and experience it fresh and personally each time, regardless of who you are. Amnesia the Dark Descent is very much a personal journey, and I would consider it a must-play game, and I don't say that very lightly. My requirements for a must-play game are pretty heavy. I enjoyed the Evil Within series a lot, I enjoyed the Resident Evil series a lot, but I wouldn't call either of them must-plays. Although in consideration of quarantine, I think Resident Evil is a should-play, along with a couple of other games. But Amnesia the Dark Descent, the first one, is absolutely a must-play. And if you can afford $20, get it on Steam and play it. It's not a super long game, it's about medium length. Ignore a pig machine, or a machine for pigs as it's properly called. No one cares. Well, a couple of people cared about that, but it's not Amnesia the Dark Descent, it's Amnesia Light. It's much light, it's an easier version of Amnesia the Dark Descent, basically. But Amnesia the Dark Descent, the first one, is a must-play. It's a very personal journey. Soma, I would consider to be a must-play. Also, a very personal journey. Both of these games, regardless of who you are, or how you think, or where you come from. Both of these experiences will be deeply personal to you. And if watching or playing Amnesia Rebirth achieves that, it's succeeded in being a successful sequel to Amnesia the Dark Descent. With that being said, thank you all very much for being here with me and listening and potentially watching. If you liked this video, please subscribe and ring the bell or notifications or whatever. I can't, for some reason, I'm having a brain cramp and can't remember what it's called. Please like and subscribe. There we go. I'll go with that. And have a great 24 hours. Thank you very much.